Is President Nayib Bukele saving El Salvador or sacrificing its future? Once self-styled as the world's coolest dictator, Bukele has cracked down hard on gang violence, making El Salvador safer than it's been in decades. But with tough questions looming over human rights and democracy, has his success come at a cost? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Nayib Bukele. Well, since taking office, Nayib Bukele has made headlines with his aggressive stance on gang violence, promising to transform El Salvador into a safer nation. Now, his administration has seen significant reductions in crime, with many citizens simply saying they feel more secure than ever. But his hardline approach has drawn sharp criticism from human rights advocates who warn that his tactics may violate civil liberties and undermine democratic institutions. As the country navigates these complex issues, questions arise about the long-term impact of Bukele's policies on the country's future. Here's a look.
Nayib Bukele swept into office in 2019, promising to crush the gang violence that had terrorized El Salvador for decades. Tapping into the public's frustration, he won in a landslide, breaking the decades-long dominance of the old political elite that had failed to make the country safer.
This battle is for every Salvadoran who has been ignored and abandoned by the previous governments, who had to emigrate and leave everything behind, and for every Salvadoran who wants the best for their children.
Before Bukele, El Salvador had one of the world's highest murder rates, with neighborhoods under gang control and extortion a part of daily life. Bukele vowed to change this, launching a brutal crackdown. In his war on gangs, security forces detained tens of thousands of suspected gang members and packed the country's prisons. Rights groups criticize his heavy-handed methods, but for many Salvadorians, the results speak for themselves.
There is more security. I feel calmer. I can go for a walk. I go out to walk every night with my young children around the neighborhood. Before, I didn't even take them out. I can go everywhere.
Freedom for those on the outside maybe, but Bukele's strategy has come at a cost. El Salvador now has one of the highest incarceration rates globally, with nearly 2% of its population behind bars.
There's a humanitarian crisis in El Salvador. I say in El Salvador because it is not just in the prisons. There is a humanitarian crisis in the prisons with these individuals who have been arbitrarily detained by the regime. Families don't know what condition they are in, whether they are dead, alive, sick, or what state of health they are in.
Bukele seems unfazed by such claims. Embracing the coolest dictator label, he even altered El Salvador's constitution to allow himself a second term. And in February, Salvadorians re-elected him by a wide margin, further cementing his grip on power. But Bukele's tough-on-crime success has yet to translate to the economy, as a quarter of Salvadorians live in poverty. In 2021, Bukele declared Bitcoin legal tender to boost the economy and attract investment. But its volatile nature has made it unreliable for everyday use.
Bitcoin is too unstable for an economy like ours, and I say that as an ordinary citizen. I respect if someone likes it and has money to invest in it, but for many of us, it's a luxury we can't afford.
As Bukele's hardline tactics gain traction among right-wing leaders throughout Latin America, the challenges going forward for El Salvador lie in balancing the desire for people's safety with personal freedoms and reducing chronic poverty.
Well, joining me now to look further at El Salvador after 5 years of President Bukele's unorthodox policies are from the capital, San Salvador, digital content editor at El Faro, Nelson Rauda Zablah. From Miami, director of the Center for the Administration of Justice at Florida International University, Jose Miguel Cruz. And from Indiana, co-director at the Central America Research Alliance at the University of Notre Dame, Tom Hare. Thanks all so much for being with me. Nelson, I'll begin with you because you are in El Salvador. So, to what extent have Bukele's policies worked and at what cost? Starting with, of course, security, because critics say he's just locking up hundreds of thousands of people with no long-term plan.
I would agree with that criticism. The reality in the communities is that people feel a lot safer nowadays. People have seen remarkable changes in their communities, and journalists, even us, we are critical journalists with the government, not just this government. We have seen that. I've gone into communities that I have never gone into in my whole life in this country. And that's one of, I would say that that's the main reason for Bukele's popularity now. The cost is what we keep explaining. The cost has been democracy. We no longer have a system that has checks and balances in place. We no longer have the ability to defend properly in a court of law. And people don't seem to realize that, even if there are media and organizations that are warning them, until it's a problem for them. Since this is a country that has had such a history of violence for so long, the empathy skills have been kind of lost in the way due to trauma, due to several valid reasons. But people don't seem to think about the consequences of not being able to withstand power or giving all power to a single person, to us willingly diving head first into a dictatorship. And it's just a problem when you realize that there's no way out. And that's what we've been telling. There's over 8,000 people arrested. We have no particular way of saying how many of people had links with gangs, how many of them didn't. And yes, this has been the cost.
Right. I mean, let me turn to Jose Miguel, because the solution to one of the highest murder rates in the world is never going to be easy, if you call it a solution. But is what we're seeing right now in El Salvador, is it sustainable?
It is not. It is not sustainable because basically what Bukele has done is taking El Salvador, which was a sort of a hybrid regime, semi-democratic regime, into a sort of more authoritarian regime, because now all the power rests on the security forces, on the police and the military, and they have complete power to arrest people, put in jail basically for no reason, just on the suspicion of being a gang member. And we know from the work of human rights organizations that a lot of people, and this has been admitted even by the government, right? A lot of people who are innocent are in jail accused of being gang members, even being tortured, being suffering from violence in the prisons. So this is coming at a high cost, and it's not sustainable, because after a while, you cannot keep 80,000 people in prison, especially if a large percentage of them are not criminals, are not gang members, are innocent people, right? And they have to go back to their normal life, right? And that's also that also has a cost for the Salvadoran economy, because you're imprisoning people who are in their age to be economically active.
Yeah. By the way, I should have said tens of thousands, not necessarily hundreds of thousands. But Jose Miguel, I'm going to stick with you, because the question is if the crackdown on these gangs has added trauma on top of trauma that could backfire at some point. Or is this, in a sense, the pain that needs to be felt for the country to finally put an ultra-violent past behind it?
Exactly. And as Nelson said, right, certainly people in many communities are feeling safer, right? But in some communities, that security, or that sense of security, is basically being replaced by some sense of fear from the security forces. So what has happened is that people stop being afraid of the gang members, and now people are starting to feel afraid of the government forces, which also, capture, arrest, and take people without any criminal record, right?
Right.
So that's adding more trauma to the Salvadorian society in the long term.
Yeah. Tom, I could see you agreeing with a lot of what you heard there. But now there are people asking the question because other leaders in the region are talking about following this model. Do you think it's the right model, or is it, highly specific to El Salvador, especially if you're looking at a country, in the region like Haiti that also has a massive gang problem?
Yeah, there's no doubt that people are looking at El Salvador as a model, and for the reasons that Nelson and Jose Miguel have explained, it is a challenging proposition and a really risky and dangerous proposition. I think, just to pick up on Jose Miguel's last point and put some numbers behind it, our partners at Cruz in El Salvador have documented almost 4,000 cases of arbitrary detention, which would be equivalent to about 1/4 of all crime committed in the country these days. So you're looking at a real replacement of social crime by state crime, and that does lead to some amount of insecurity and additional trauma. But and replacing, looking around the region, when you look at Guatemala, when you look at Honduras, even Haiti, Costa Rica now that has an influx of insecurity, Ecuador, saying, hey, this maybe is, maybe there's something going on here. Maybe the international community is wrong about promoting human rights and due process. And I think that's a really risky proposition for the mere fact that El Salvador is a small country, has a smaller population relative to these other countries, and it's less controlled. As much power as the gangs did have, they had nowhere near the power that drug cartels and trafficking organizations have, these transnational organizations, and their reach within some of those governments. So I don't think replicating this model would be bad for human rights. It would be bad in the long run for other countries, and I don't think they would see the same results.
Okay, but Tom, are there any parts of it that you can kind of pick off and say this could work, if not taken to an extreme and with, still respecting democratic institutions, or is it kind of as a blanket policy just not to be emulated?
Well, I think I go back to what Nelson said of the erosion of democracy, and if you don't have these checks and balances from a strong judiciary or from an active judiciary, you're really headed in a dangerous direction. I think there are cases, you can look at Honduras that had a limited state of exception in certain municipalities on a much lower scale, to some success, but less success. And then an end to that. And I think that's the fear here is where is the end? Is there a natural end? What will come of this in the end? And that's the real danger, because when you start to take away, liberties, individual liberties, due process rights, reestablishing them is going to be very difficult.
Right, because at the foundation, Nelson, you've said that the conditions that generated all of the gangs in the first place are still there, mainly the poverty and the inequality that has existed in El Salvador now for most of its history. I mean, is Bukele looking at addressing those fundamental issues at all?
No, he isn't. He's a dictator, and he surrounded himself with oligarchs, and that's what they do, and that's what you'll see everywhere when a strong man comes into power. I always kind of laugh at the suggestion that the model could be emulated anywhere else, because what is the model? Let's kind of remember the facts here. For the first 2.5 years of his government, Bukele had in place a pact, a negotiation with the gangs, which has been documented not only by journalists, not only by audio, not only by the documents of coming from the prisons, but also for the U.S. State Department and Treasury departments. So when that negotiation broke down, the gangs massacred 87 people in 3 days, in a 3-day killing spree, which was the worst killing spree since the peace accords in El Salvador in '92. And then came the state of exception. What kind of model is that? It's an improvisation. Why didn't he do the state of exception from the get-go? And even in 2021, he had already the control of the legislative and judicial branch. So there's not much of a model there. There's a negotiation with gangs. There's a pattern of hiding all public information from the government, from the public. So I don't really, and as Tom was saying, I don't see it being replicable. El Salvador is the size of New Jersey. The government had control of the prisons, which you cannot say it in many places. You cannot say in Ecuador or in Haiti.
Yeah, Jose Miguel, I can see.
On the other hand, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Jose Miguel.
No, if I can add to Nelson's point, actually. So usually, people say, oh, that the Bukele model needs to be replicated elsewhere, especially in Latin America, right? But what usually is not said is that El Salvador, as Nelson was saying, is a very tiny country, right? I live in Miami-Dade
New Jersey,
County, which is basically a little bit smaller than El Salvador. So El Salvador is almost like the size of Miami-Dade County, right? So it's a small country, which is easier to use security forces to control over the territory. That's one point. The second point, which is important, usually it gets overlooked, is that in El Salvador, the main responsible for violence, the criminal violence, were two gangs, right? Two gang networks, which are MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, right? And as Nelson said, once the government negotiated with the leaders of those gangs, basically Bukele was able to control everything that happened in these criminal networks. What happened in the rest of Latin America, in countries like Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Brazil is almost a continent, right? Mexico is a huge country with many different criminal actors, many different cartels. So in order to do something like Bukele did, the governments will have to negotiate with absolutely all of those criminal actors, which is almost impossible in order to get the results that Bukele is having in El Salvador. So El Salvador, Bukele had it easier to some extent just because it's a tiny country and also because most of the criminal activities were controlled by two networks with whom he negotiated.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Tom, in the United States, actually, to hear about Matt Gaetz, who is now looking at becoming Attorney General. Very high chance he will be. He's actually looking at El Salvador's model for the U.S. I mean, knowing that anything can really happen in the political landscape in the United States right now, would you expect incredibly dramatic steps to be taken in the U.S. based on the results of El Salvador?
No, I mean, I got chills as you said that, because I think that's a very frightening proposition, as it has been for Salvadorans for a number of years now. But I would like to hope and think that our institutions, I mean, when you look at El Salvador, certainly came from a place of a transition to democracy. It's still a very young democracy. And I feel like in the United States, I hope that our checks and balances are a little stronger. They're certainly with a complete control of Congress by the Republican Party, fewer checks and less maybe on the judicial side. I don't think I think there's certainly one of the first things they came out to say about even the detention of potential migrants around the country is the logistical challenge of can you really be that effective, and certainly the idea of putting the military in the streets. I think people are going to have a strong reaction to that, a strong negative reaction to that, and I certainly hope that's not the road that the next administration tries to go down, and I don't think that the levels of violence or perceived violence in the United States, or the perceived sense of insecurity, is real. It certainly is in certain neighborhoods, in certain areas, but it's not a widespread phenomenon like it was in El Salvador, and certainly does not merit the same kind of response.
Right. Nelson, let me come back to you, because we haven't even really looked at the economy yet. I mean, we talked about the poverty and inequality that exists, that Bukele, you say, has yet to even try to address. So first, explain to us, if you can, I mean, among El Salvadorians, financially, does, Bukele really just represent the elite? And then with that, where is his whole, Bitcoin project going? Because at one point he was down about $150 million, which is a lot of money for an economy like El Salvador's. It's up again, I know, and now he's been tweeting, "See, I told you so," on about Bitcoin, that this was the right place to be, or the right place to take El Salvador. I mean, what do you think? Is this good for El Salvador? Will that be something that can gain him points, or is he just taking the economy to the casino?
I think the casino is a great metaphor, which I've used in my reporting. Listen, El Salvador is a country that has 30% of the population in poverty. There's a million people, close to a million people, that are in the risk of famine. That's the reality of the country. Around 80% of the country earns less than $400 a month. So when you see Bukele has done a great job as portraying himself to be close to the people when he comes from a rich family, and he has done politics around benefiting the rich, which authoritarian men usually do, and he has continued doing. Bitcoin is not an exception. Bitcoin is not a policy that Salvadorans have paid, but it's not a policy that Salvadorans have benefited. I think the worst measure of Bitcoin, of the success of public policy, is the price going up or down. That is not what the president said that it would do. The president promised that Bitcoin would make remittances, which are about 20% of the economy, would make them cheaper to send. He said that it would attract foreign investment, that would create jobs. And he said that it would include the people in the bank in the bank system. Around 70% of Salvadorans do not have bank accounts. Bitcoin didn't do any of that. It has been in place for 2 or 3 years now. It didn't achieve any of those goals. So if you're saying now that Bitcoin was not a failure when the price was down, it's not a success now that the price goes up. I was saying, if the bet was to make money out of this, to put public money and to make money out of this, what is the difference of giving the finance ministry $5 million and sending him to pay him back? Let's see what you can come up with. This is not the way that we should measure this public policy.
So, I mean, Jose Miguel, is this a bet that could go horribly wrong, or is Bitcoin only kind of being tested on the margins of El Salvador's economy right now?
Well, I think I'm not a specialist on Bitcoin, but I think it's definitely being tested on the margins, and it's more. The way it was implemented in El Salvador, it was more like a gamble for Bukele. I wanted to try this new approach, and wanted to present himself as an innovator, which is as has been said before. I mean, this was basically using El Salvador as a huge casino, right? I mean, the bottom line is that El Salvador, as has been said, it has high levels of poverty and inequality, and this is not helping at all. Actually, it might go in the opposite direction. Surveys have shown that less than 10% of people have ever used any of the one of these applications or Chivo Wallet, whatever.
Yeah.
So people are not really using that, and I don't think that is going to help in any way.
Okay. Down to our last 2 minutes, so let me get back to Tom quickly before we go. So Tom, I mean, I don't know, how much is this Bitcoin policy kind of symbolic of the unpredictability and risks that Bukele has been willing to take without quite knowing the future costs? And also, he was questionably re-elected in the first place. Many said it was unconstitutional. And come re-election time, where do you see that part of their democracy going again?
Yeah, I think whether you look at Bitcoin, whether you look at the state of exception and some of the other policies, the fact is he's, for the first time in his administration, or now his second administration, he's starting to slip in popularity. He still has a very high, one of the highest in the world, certainly in Latin America. But a good percentage of people in the last polling done by the University of Central America say that their opinion of him has declined in the past year. And that's because of what we were seeing at the beginning of poverty and inequality. It goes back to that. Until Salvadorans see improvements in health and public works in the economy and really addressing the impact of inflation, he's going to continue to slip in some of this polling. I think they want to see him take the momentum and the security and the sense of security that's been built up and really capitalize on it. And I think that's what a lot of the international community wants to see too, of taken for what it is now at this point. The state of exception is delivered on security, but the real test will be what he can do with those gains and if he can make improvements in the daily lives of other Salvadorans.
Okay. Tom, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. Very unfortunately, we're out of time, so I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for joining me, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.